everyone, my name is Kyle Seyboth and I am a local real estate agent with Keller Realty, and I welcome you to the new show, the new series, All Things Real Estate. And the purpose of the show is to be educational. So it's an educational show for buyers and sellers, whether you're in the local markets here throughout southeastern Massachusetts or somewhere in Rhode Island. What I'm looking to do is get in front of people and explain the entire process of everything related to real estate. So this is the first episode. So this episode really just wanted to explain kind of who I am, what my goals are with the show, and where I'm looking to take this show in the future. So we'll start with my background, who I am, where I'm from, what I do, what company I'm with, so on and so forth. So again, my name, Kyle Seyboth. I'm a realtor with Keller Realty. I have an office, I have 3 offices. I have one that's my private office in Seekonk. I have another which is in Lincoln, Rhode Island, and I have a 3rd office in Charles Street in Providence. So why is that beneficial? It's helpful because I serve the entire state of Rhode Island and I serve southeastern Massachusetts. So with a home base here in Seekonk, it allows me to service the local area, to Seekonk, Rehoboth, Attleboro, Taunton, that area in southeastern Mass. And then with my centrally located office in Providence, it allows me to serve Providence, Cranston, Pawtucket, East Providence, those locations, as well as Warwick and down more in the South County. And then I also have the Lincoln office, which helps me serve the northern part of the state. So those 3 offices are helpful for me. I'm with Keller Realty, and I've been there for 8 years, and I've been a local realtor for 8 years, and I've been actually the top realtor in the state of Rhode Island and Massachusetts for the last 3, and I've been the top Keller Williams agent for the last 3 years. So definitely have a plethora of experience that's been helpful to my clients. It's been helpful to buyers. It's been helpful to sellers. And I really want to just make this educational for the viewers to understand the process of, what comes down when you buy or sell a property. So that is my background. Prior to real estate, I worked in finance. So I have a background in finance, which is helpful with real estate because a lot of my clients are investors and they look to invest in property. They buy and sell, they buy and flip, they do different things with investment properties, they buy and hold rental properties. So these are all different things that I can kind of bring to the table to help everyone out and educate people on that process of buying and selling. So my background, I think I covered. So what is this show about? What are we looking to do? What am I looking to do? The show is, as it's named, All Things Real Estate. My goal is every single week for the show's entirety to have guests on. And what I'll be looking to bring on, I'll bring on attorneys, I'll bring on lenders, I'll bring on real estate investors, I'll bring on fellow realtors, I'll bring on any part of the transaction that I can actually bring someone here to ask questions, to go over things, to give input, to give answers. That's what I'm looking to do. So every week I'm expecting to have a different guest on. You may have some repeat guests, but I'm expecting to have a different guest to kind of go over the process and what they do within a real estate transaction. I think this is something that's lacking. I think it's something that folks need to see, hear, touch, understand, especially from local experts. So if I can get some local folks here that can help explain the local market, the lending, the legal end of things, so that you guys can understand what that looks like if you ever go to buy or sell a property. So that's the goal. The goal is to bring people on, to interview, to talk, to be really all about things that are real estate related. Outside of that, what I expect to do is also do some site visits. So myself, I do some investing, I do some flipping, I do some buying and holding. So with that, I plan on bringing the crew out with us to some different job sites so you can understand what that looks like. What takes place in a home inspection? What do inspectors look for? How does an investor that looks to do a flip, how do they evaluate what the property's worth, what it needs, and if it makes sense? If I'm buying and selling a piece of real estate that is focused on income returns or focused on rental income, how can I make the numbers make sense, and how do I determine if it's a good or bad investment? So these are all the things that I think a field trip would help with ultimately. So goals, like I said, first thing, bring folks on the show. Secondly, we're going to be doing some field trips. We're going to get you guys out there, and we're going to understand what the process looks like from all different facets of real estate. So outside of that, what I'd like to talk about today is just basically just the different players within a real estate transaction. So when I bring these folks on, you can understand why they're here, what they do, and how it relates to a buyer and or a seller. So to break things down very simply, right? When you sell a piece of real estate, there's a number of different people that are involved in the process. So the first thing is, if I'm selling real estate, there's a seller, right? There's a house, right, which is the asset. There's a listing agent, okay? So when I go to sell my property, the first thing I do is I need to contact a real estate professional to come out and take a look at my property and determine what the value is. So when a real estate professional comes out to your house, they're gonna do a number of things. Number one, they're gonna come to the house and explain the do's and don'ts, the good and bad, the pretty and ugly of your property to make it so it's ready to be showed and ready to be out there, right? So that professional will come along, they'll meet with you, they'll walk through the house, they'll explain to you what you need to take down, what you should change, paint, this, that, and the other, and that'll give you a good premise to get started. After that, that professional should go back and be able to come up with a value on your property, right? So it's really hard to sell your house if you don't have a value, right? So by having a value, that realtor, that real estate broker will go back and run what's called comparable sale comps. And those comps will tell you what your house is priced compared to other houses in the area. So these other houses will allow the real estate professional to come up with a value on your property that should be either plus or minus, you know, a couple $1,000s here or there based upon different attributes that your house has that these other houses don't have, or that they have that you don't have. So on the seller side, there's a seller, there's a house, there's a realtor, right? Now on the buyer side, right, because you're going to put your house on the market, there's a buyer, right? So there's buyers looking at your house. Typically these buyers, they have their own real estate professionals on their end, right? So the buyer A comes to look at your property. He or she has a realtor. That realtor helps them get into the property, see the property, negotiate whether they like the property or not, any sort of offer. And from there, that allows the buyer to move forward with the transaction. So the buyer, it's himself or herself. The realtor on the buyer side, right? Those are the two key components of that portion of the transaction. So now one important thing that I think a lot of people don't know, and this is something that's very important when you're buying a property, it's always good to have a realtor on your side. You don't pay that person anything. So when you work with a buyer's agent, right, the seller has a listing agent, the buyer has what's called a buyer's agent. That agent actually doesn't get paid $1 from you. So they look out for your best interest, but they don't receive any money from you as the buyer. They get paid, right? Because this is a good question. How does that buyer's agent get paid? And that buyer's agent gets paid from the listing broker splits his or her commission with that buyer agent. So let's just say the seller, right, pays out a 5% commission to the listing broker. Listing agent A gets 2.5%. Listing agent B gets 2.5%. Buyer's agent B rather gets 2.5%. So the 5% gets split between a buyer agent and a selling agent, right? The listing agent. Because a lot of people think if they come in alone and they say, hey, if I don't have a listing agent, I'm going to get a better deal. The seller is going to pay that 5% no matter what. Maybe there's a concession from 5 to 4%, but that seller's either going to put all that money in the listing agent's pocket, or that money is going to get split between the buyer's agent and the listing agent. Okay? So those are really important things to understand when you're buying a house and when you're selling a house. So now you say, okay, Mr. Buyer has come along and they put through an offer, right? So we put in an offer, the buyer's offered on a property. The seller and buyer are now, you know, going back and forth, and they're counter offering, they're going back and forth between the offers. So the agents are involved, they're involved in the transaction, and they're involved in the negotiation. So once a transaction gets executed, right, so we agree, the buyer agrees to X, the seller agrees to X, we now have a verbal or written agreement, right? So now what's the next step typically? So both states, Rhode Island and Mass, are different, but both states have the same sort of premise as what goes next. So outside of signing a purchase and sales agreement, which is the contract that binds a seller and a buyer to a house, right? Because Rhode Island and Mass can differ as to how that actual transpires and what point that works versus the offer form and so on and so forth. But once that document is signed or started, in both states now is the home inspection, okay? So the buyer of the house has the legal right to do a home inspection. And most buyers, you don't understand how that works, or why would I do an inspection? So most buyers say to me, hey, why would I do an inspection after we agree on an offer? I'd like to know what's going on first. And the reason is you always want to make sure the buyer and seller agree before you spend money on an inspection. If you go and spend money on a home inspection, right, and you spend that money on an inspection, but you didn't have an agreed upon offer, you're just wasting money because you don't know if your offer is going to get accepted by that seller and or by the buyer. You guys are going to agree. So the inspection is always after an offer is accepted, okay? So that comes the next piece of a transaction. So we've talked about the beginning, now we're at the next piece. So the next piece, when the inspection is done, you still have the buyer, you have the buyer's agent, seller, listing agent, and the next step is the inspector, right? So what does an inspection entail without getting too deep into it? What does that mean? What does that mean for a buyer? What does it mean for a seller? So basically the buyer has the right to do a home inspection to determine any inefficiencies, any deficiencies, any positives, any negatives about the property to make sure they want to move forward with the sale. So if the buyer engages an inspector, right? So the buyer engages an inspector. First question I always get is who pays for that? Okay, is that part of closing costs, or who pays for that? So the inspection is paid for by the buyer. The buyer pays that number out of pocket. So Mr. Buyer or Mrs. Buyer, they engage an inspector, and that inspector performs the task and the duty of doing the inspection. Now, the inspection's done, right? So we do the inspection's done. It comes back terrible. This house is awful, it's falling apart, it's no good. The buyer has the right to do one of three things. They can accept it as is, they can negotiate with the seller items that came up on the inspection report, or they can back out of the transaction. So buyer has three options, right? Three different options that can happen after an inspection. That's where the seller and buyer go back and forth to try to keep the deal alive, and that's a whole nother round of a negotiation. Now with the inspection, let's just say the buyer backs out. So buyer A, backs out of the transaction. Do I get my money back as a buyer for an inspection, right? Do I get I pay $500 to Mr. Inspector, do I actually get that money back? The answer is no. And buyers get somewhat frustrated with this, but the answer is no, because the inspector performed their job. Whether you buy the house or not, that's on you as the buyer, but the inspector still gets paid regardless if you move forward or not. So that's the next layer of essentially kind of who's involved with the transaction. And then prior to that, I guess I should have started with the mortgage professional, right? So there's a mortgage broker typically on the buyer side, And that buyer, when they go to put an offer in on a property, that buyer is approved by a mortgage, either a bank, a broker, a mortgage company that is working on the mortgage as these processes are moving forward. So the buyer's already been pre-approved prior to putting the offer in, but as this inspection is going on, the mortgage company is working on getting all the documentation to bring this buyer to a closing. So the mortgage professional, his or her job is to collect all the documents from the buyers, right? To order what's called an appraisal, which will come after the inspection, which is another step and another layer of the transaction. So there's an appraiser involved. Once we get through the home inspection and we're willing to move forward, the appraiser will go out and determine the value of the property, right? So that value of that property is determined by an independent appraiser hired by the bank or mortgage company to determine that the buyer is paying fair market value, okay? So we have the mortgage person working on the loan, we're through inspections, we have the appraisal going on, that comes back, you know, it could come back fine at the right value, comes back low where renegotiation happens, or comes back high where it's a moot point and the buyer got a good deal. So that's the step of the appraisal. Now towards the end of the transaction, this is when typically the attorneys get involved. So normally, and I say normally very carefully, the buyer has their own attorney, the seller has their own attorney, the buyer's attorney is appointed by the bank typically or mortgage company, the seller's attorney is chosen by the seller, and the job of the attorneys is to take this transaction and basically bring it home to a closing, okay? So that's at the end. So, right, so we kind of went through all the layers of who's in a transaction for the most part, and then these are the people that I want to get in front of us so they can explain in more detail kind of what they do, what their organization is about, how they help buyers, how they help sellers, the good, the bad, the ugly of a transaction. So just to kind of recalibrate that and bring that back to full circle, when you have a transaction, you have a buyer, you have a seller, you have an asset, which is a home or a commercial property, you have a listing broker, you have a buyer's agent, you have an inspector, you have an appraiser, you have two attorneys on both sides, and then you have your mortgage professional that kind of ties the whole thing together. Without them, obviously, there's no loan, and without a loan, there's no purchase. So those are the folks that I'm looking to get in front of everyone, go over things with people. I'm looking forward to the show. I think it's going to be a great show. I know today was very informative and just kind of going over what it is and what we're looking to do. But I think next week, and we'll be on every week, next week we'll have a different professional. My goal is to get someone in a different field almost every week, so that will be beneficial for everyone. I don't know who it will be yet, and it will be somewhat of a surprise to the audience because I'll bring someone in different. So that's really all I have for today. Just want to make sure I keep it informative. What I am going to do on the next segment is I will give out either a phone number or an email address where you guys can contact me. If you have questions, feel free to text your questions. If you have topics that want to be discussed, feel free to send over any email, text message, phone call. Hey, I think you should discuss this. Hey, I think you discuss that. I think this is great. I think this is no good. Feedback is wanted. Feedback is accepted. So with that, I look forward to next week. We'll have a great guest. We'll have a great show. Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next week.